Jane's death closed the chapter of hope that had driven Henry for most of his reign. Edward would be Henry's last child. And in a century when men commonly fathered children well into their later years, that silence was striking. The price of success had been absolute. Henry finally had his heir, but the cost was another dead queen, and the pattern that had followed him for decades, pregnancy, loss, blame, had not ended. It had only changed shape. Jane Seymour became the woman Henry remembered most fondly, not because she lived, but because she died having fulfilled her purpose. And in that truth lies the darkest contradiction of Tudor power. The dynasty survived, but only through the bodies of women who did not. By 1540, the problem could no longer be ignored. When Henry VIII married Anne of Cleves, the match was political rather than personal, and was a German princess, chosen to secure Protestant alliances at a moment when England felt threatened by Catholic Europe. Henry agreed to the marriage based largely on her portrait, painted by Hans Holbein the Younger, a court artist trusted to capture truth rather than flattery. What Henry expected and what he received did not align. From their first meeting, something went wrong. Henry later claimed he was repulsed by Anne's appearance, that she failed to excite him, that her body inspired nothing but disgust. These accusations would echo through history, shaping Anne of Cleves' reputation for centuries. But the contemporary evidence tells a quieter story. No ambassador described Anne as ugly. Courtiers found her polite, agreeable, and unremarkable in appearance. Holbein's portrait, which still survives, shows a woman neither extraordinary nor grotesque, simply human. Despite Henry's misgivings, the marriage went forward. Backing out would have caused diplomatic disaster. And it was after the wedding that the real crisis revealed itself. Henry could not consummate the marriage. He tried. He failed. In desperation, Henry confessed his failure to his physician. But even in that private moment, he could not allow the truth to settle where it belonged. Instead, he shifted the blame outward. And disgusted him, he insisted. Her body was the problem, not his. He even claimed to have experienced nocturnal emissions that same night, offering them as proof that his body functioned perfectly well when presented with the right woman. This detail matters. In a world where royal authority rested on visible strength and virility, admitting impotence would have been catastrophic. It would have cast doubt on Henry's ability to produce more heirs. It would have exposed weakness at the center of power. So the narrative was rewritten. Anne of Cleves became the explanation. Her body absorbed the failure that Henry could not afford to claim. The marriage was annulled in July 1540, declared unconsummated and therefore invalid, and understood the danger of resistance. She had seen what happened to women who challenged Henry's version of events. She agreed to the annulment and, in return, was granted estates, income, and the honorary title of the king's beloved sister. She survived, but survival came with its own cost, and spent the rest of her life explaining herself, her body, her marriage, her supposed inadequacy, to a court that had already decided where blame belonged. Henry moved on quickly. Less than 3 weeks later, he married again. And once more, a woman's body was left carrying the weight of a truth the king could not speak aloud. By the time Catherine Howard became queen, the contrast was stark. She was 19 years old, young, beautiful, and full of the vitality Henry no longer possessed. To the court, she appeared to be the perfect solution, the kind of body that should have produced heirs easily, repeatedly, without complication. But nothing happened. Not once during their marriage did Catherine conceive. No pregnancy, no miscarriage, no stillbirth, no sign of life at all. In a woman of her age, at the height of fertility, the silence was impossible to ignore. By now, Henry was no longer the man he had once been. He was massively overweight. His leg wound, sustained years earlier, had never healed and was frequently infected, oozing and agonizing. He could barely walk without assistance. His temper was volatile, his moods unpredictable, his body in constant pain. Intimacy was no longer effortless, perhaps no longer possible. Still, the blame did not move. When rumors surfaced that Catherine had engaged in relationships before her marriage, and possibly during it, Henry seized upon them. Whether those affairs truly occurred, or whether they amounted to youthful indiscretion magnified into treason, remains uncertain. What mattered was that Henry believed the accusations. In February 1542, Catherine Howard was beheaded. She was barely 20 years old. Once again, a woman paid with her body for a failure that was never fully examined. Henry was now 50. His physical decline was undeniable. Courtiers carried him upstairs. His presence was marked by the smell of infection and decay. The once athletic king had become a man trapped inside a failing body. And yet, he married again. Catherine Parr was 31, educated, intelligent, and twice widowed. Neither of her previous marriages had produced children, but both husbands had been gravely ill. In those unions, Catherine had acted more as a caretaker than a wife. With Henry, she never conceived. Not once in 4 years. The court whispered, as it always did, that she must be infertile, that her body was barren, that she had failed where duty demanded success. No one paused to consider the obvious alternative. Then, in January 1547, Henry VIII died. Within months, Catherine Parr remarried, and almost immediately, she became pregnant. She gave birth to a daughter. The implication was devastating in its simplicity. Catherine Parr had not been infertile. Catherine Howard had not been incapable of conception. The absence of children in Henry's final marriages pointed away from the women and back toward the king himself. By the end of his life, Henry had surrounded himself with evidence he could no longer fully silence. Young wives who did not conceive, a healthy woman who became pregnant only after his death, a body that no longer functioned as it once had. And still, the narrative endured. Failure was feminine. Blame was feminine. Responsibility was never his. But the facts had begun to speak for themselves, and they were asking a question Henry had spent his entire reign avoiding. What if the problem had never been the women at all? For centuries, the explanation was simple. God was angry. Henry had sinned. The deaths were punishment. That belief was powerful because it was familiar. It fit a world that understood tragedy through morality. And for a long time, no alternative seemed possible. But modern medicine offers different ways of reading the same evidence. The first theory people reach for is diabetes. By his 40s, Henry was massively overweight. His armor from the 1540s suggests a waist exceeding 50 inches. He suffered from chronic fatigue, erratic moods, and a leg wound that refused to heal. Diabetes can cause erectile dysfunction, reduced libido, and declining sexual function. It could explain why Henry stopped fathering children after Edward's birth in 1537. But it explains only part of the story. Diabetes affects the man. It does not cause repeated miscarriages, stillbirths, or infant deaths in multiple women across decades. It cannot account for Catherine of Aragon's long chain of losses, or in Boleyn's miscarriages, or the number of Tudor babies who died at birth or within weeks. It explains silence, not slaughter. Another theory gained popularity in the 19th century, syphilis. Syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease known to cause miscarriages, stillbirths, premature births, and infant death. Untreated, it can lead to rashes, lesions, hair loss, dementia, and eventual death. On paper, it seemed to fit the pattern perfectly. A promiscuous king, dead children, a moral narrative ready-made. But the evidence collapses under scrutiny. There is no contemporary record of Henry displaying the visible symptoms of syphilis. No sores, no rashes, no neurological decline consistent with late-stage infection. More importantly, none of his wives showed signs of the disease, and none of his surviving children, Mary, Elizabeth, or Edward, exhibited symptoms of congenital syphilis. Even more telling, syphilis in Tudor England was treated with mercury. Those treatments were dangerous, expensive, and carefully documented. No such records exist for Henry or his queens. The theory survives not because it is strong, but because it is convenient. What remains is a quieter explanation, and a far more unsettling one. In 2010, modern researchers proposed that Henry VIII may have carried a rare blood type, Kel positive, or possibly been Rh positive in a way incompatible with his wives. These conditions operate through a simple but devastating mechanism. The first pregnancy between a compatible pair often proceeds normally. But during birth or miscarriage, the mother's immune system is exposed to the baby's blood. If the baby carries an antigen the mother lacks, her immune system becomes sensitized. From that point on, every subsequent pregnancy with a similarly positive fetus is at risk. The mother's body does not fail. It fights. Her immune system attacks the fetus's red blood cells, leading to severe anemia, heart failure, miscarriage, stillbirth, or death within days or weeks of birth. The pattern is precise. A first pregnancy that appears normal, then repeated losses, then, occasionally, a surviving child, if that child happens to share the mother's blood type rather than the father's. This model fits Catherine of Aragon with chilling accuracy. Her early pregnancies may have sensitized her immune system. Every subsequent male child, inheriting Henry's blood factors, would have been attacked. Princess Mary may have survived because she did not carry the incompatible trait. The same explanation works for Boleyn. Elizabeth's birth could have triggered sensitization. The pregnancies that followed did not survive. It also explains why women who had only one pregnancy with Henry, Elizabeth Blunt and Jane Seymour, produced living sons. There was no second exposure, no immune response yet activated, and it explains something else. Why the deaths seemed random to those living through them. Why no one could predict which pregnancy would succeed and which would end in tragedy. Why blame fell so easily on women, whose bodies bore the visible consequences. This was not divine punishment, not moral failure, not corruption of character. It was biology, a genetic incompatibility carried silently by a king, one that destroyed pregnancies, shattered women, and destabilized a dynasty, all without leaving a mark anyone in the 16th century could recognize. Henry VIII did not understand this. He could not have. But the evidence suggests that the catastrophe he spent his life trying to outrun was written into his blood long before his crown touched his head. And the women who died in his shadow were not cursed. They were collateral damage of a genetic accident history did not yet have words for. When Henry VIII died in January 1547, the noise finally stopped. No more weddings, no more trials, no more pregnancies forced under the weight of a crown. What remained was the record. 2 wives executed, several others discarded, a nursery filled with names that never reached adulthood. Henry left behind a kingdom reshaped by his obsession, religion torn apart, power centralized, loyalty enforced through fear. But beneath the political legacy lay something quieter and far more intimate, a trail of bodies left by a single demand that could never be satisfied. In the end, Henry achieved what he wanted. He had a legitimate son, but the triumph came too late and at too high a cost. Edward VI would rule only briefly. The boy whose birth had justified decades of destruction would die young, fragile and sickly, unable to continue the line his father had sacrificed so much to secure. And the greatest Tudor ruler would not be a son at all. It would be Elizabeth, the daughter Henry dismissed, doubted, and once considered a failure. The child born of disappointment became the most enduring legacy of his reign. Henry spent his life assigning blame. To Catherine of Aragon, to Boleyn, to of Cleves, to Catherine Howard, to Catherine Parr. Each woman carried the weight of his fear. Each body became a surface onto which failure could be written. And when their bodies broke, history accepted the explanation without question. But the pattern tells another story. These women did not die because they were weak. They did not fail because they were cursed. They did not destroy the Tudor line. They were crushed beneath an obsession that turned biology into guilt and motherhood into a sentence. They paid for a problem that could not be seen, could not be understood, and could not be admitted, least of all by the man whose blood may have carried it. Henry VIII ruled by refusing responsibility. History remembered him for his power. But the true cost of that power was paid in silence, by queens who buried children, by mothers who never recovered, and by bodies that became evidence in a case they were never allowed to defend. The question, then, is not why so many women died around Henry VIII. The question is why it took so long to ask whether they were ever the ones at fault. A king with 6 wives, 11 pregnancies, and almost every child died, not in war, not through treason, but in birthing chambers, empty cradles, and the narrow corridors of royal palaces built to create heirs. For centuries, history blamed the women, their bodies, their failures, their supposed weakness. But what if that judgment was misplaced? What if the force destroying the Tudor line was not a curse, not betrayal, not God's punishment, but the king's own body, quietly undoing everything he tried to build? In May 1536, the Tower of London was not a fortress of justice. It was a stage. Inside a cold chamber of stone and shadow stood George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, courtier, diplomat, brother to the Queen. The charges laid before him were almost unspeakable: treason, adultery with the queen, incest with his own sister. Crimes so extreme that their very repetition was meant to poison the room. This was not a trial in any modern sense. It was a formality, a performance designed to destroy the Boleyn family completely. The decision had already been made elsewhere, by Henry VIII, and by Thomas Cromwell, the man tasked with turning royal will into legal fact. Witnesses were produced. Testimony was gathered from frightened servants and men who had every reason to say what was expected of them. The machinery moved forward, slow and inevitable. George was handed a document. The instruction was simple: read it silently. Acknowledge the charges. Answer yes or no, and let the process end. But George Boleyn did not follow the script. Knowing his life was already forfeit, he read the words aloud. He forced the court to hear what was meant to remain buried in ink. The document claimed that George and his sister and Boleyn had spoken openly about the king's private failures, that they had discussed, even mocked, Henry's performance in bed, that the queen herself had complained that the king possessed neither vigor nor virility. The room changed. This was no longer just treason. It was humiliation. Henry VIII had built his authority on an image of masculine power: athletic, dominant, irresistible. To question that image was to strike at the foundation of his rule. And now, in a public courtroom filled with noblemen, ambassadors, and witnesses, that doubt had been spoken aloud. Whether and ever said those words is something we will never know. There is no confession, no private letter, no definitive proof. But because George read the accusation out loud, it survived. It traveled through diplomatic correspondence, through whispered court gossip, through the margins of official records. A rumor preserved by the very act meant to silence it. 4 days later, and Boleyn was executed. George had already been condemned, and a king, whose power depended on being seen as virile and unbroken, had just been exposed in the one place he could not afford weakness: his own body. When Henry VIII came to the throne in 1509, he was only 17 years old. Young, confident, and newly crowned, he embodied everything the Tudor dynasty wanted England to see: strength, continuity, promise. Within weeks, he married Catherine of Aragon. It was not a romantic beginning. It was a political necessity. The Tudor crown was still fragile, balanced on a victory barely a generation old. Henry's father had won the throne at Bosworth in 1485, ending decades of civil war, but bloodshed leaves long memories. England had learned what happens when succession is uncertain. Rival claims do not fade. They wait. So from the moment Henry became king, the expectation was immediate and absolute. He must produce a son. Not eventually, not someday, but soon. In the 16th century, a male heir was not simply a child. He was proof. Proof that God favored the dynasty. Proof that the crown would endure beyond the current king's lifetime. Proof that England would not fall back into chaos once the throne stood empty. A daughter could not provide that certainty. A daughter could marry, leave the country, or be challenged by male relatives. England had never been ruled by a queen regnant. The idea felt unnatural, even dangerous, to those who remembered how quickly power could fracture. Henry understood this world intimately. He had been raised on stories of rebellion and betrayal, of cousins and uncles killed because the line of succession was unclear. The Tudors did not have the luxury of patience. Catherine became pregnant quickly. The court celebrated. Prayers filled chapels. Gifts were commissioned. It seemed the new reign would begin exactly as it was supposed to. But beneath the surface of celebration lay something darker. Every pregnancy carried enormous political weight. Every birth was a test not just of the queen's body, but of the king's legitimacy. Failure was not private grief. It was public vulnerability. And in that environment, there was no space for uncertainty, no tolerance for repeated loss, no language for shared responsibility. If children did not survive, someone had to be blamed. In theory, the pressure belonged to both king and queen. In practice, it fell almost entirely on the woman. This was the foundation of Henry's obsession. Not cruelty for its own sake, but fear. Fear that the Tudor crown rested on a line too thin to survive another break. Fear that without sons, everything his father had won could be undone. And fear, once rooted in power, rarely remains contained. Between 1510 and 1518, Catherine of Aragon lived almost constantly with child. There was little space between one pregnancy and the next. No period of true recovery. No pause in expectation. Each time her body failed to produce a living son, it was required to try again immediately. The first loss came quietly. In January 1510, Catherine miscarried a baby girl at 3 or 4 months. Far enough along for physicians to determine the child's sex. Not far enough for survival. Henry was disappointed, but not yet alarmed. Miscarriages were common. There would be other chances. And there were. Later that same year, Catherine conceived again. This time, she carried the pregnancy to term. On New Year's Day, 1511, a son was born, Prince Henry. He was healthy, loud, perfect. England finally had its heir. For 52 days, the Tudor dynasty felt secure. Then, without warning, the child died. There was no clear illness, no explanation, just an empty cradle and a court thrown back into uncertainty. Tudor medicine offered no answers. Physicians could only shrug and speak of God's will. There was no time to mourn properly. Grief was a luxury the dynasty could not afford. Catherine was expected to conceive again. In 1513, she did. Another son, this one premature and stillborn. Henry was away in France, leading a military campaign. He would not have left England had he believed the birth was imminent. Catherine buried another child alone. In November 1514, another pregnancy. Another boy. He lived only minutes after birth. 3 sons. 3 graves. By now, the losses were no longer dismissed as chance. Whispers began to move through the court. Quiet at first, then louder. In Tudor England, it was widely believed that a woman's body determined not only the health of a child, but its sex. Failure to produce a surviving son was interpreted as a flaw within the mother herself. The blame settled where it always did. Henry said nothing publicly, but doubt took root in private. Catherine continued to fulfill her role with dignity, but the strain was unrelenting. Pregnancy followed pregnancy. Loss followed loss. Her body was never allowed to heal. Each failure carried not just personal grief, but political consequence. In February 1516, Catherine gave birth again. This time, the child survived. A daughter, Mary. Mary was healthy, intelligent, and strong. Her survival proved that Catherine could produce a living child. But she was not what the dynasty needed. In the 16th century, daughters did not secure thrones. They complicated them. Still, hope returned. Perhaps the next pregnancy would finally bring the long-awaited prince. It did not. In November 1518, Catherine gave birth to a stillborn girl. It was the last time she ever conceived. She was 33 years old. 6 pregnancies in 9 years. 5 dead children. Endless pressure to deliver a male heir. After 1518, Catherine's body fell silent. Her health declined. She fasted for long periods. Contemporary accounts suggest deep sadness and physical exhaustion. The queen aged rapidly, worn down by grief and by a court that measured her worth by one function alone. Henry's affection cooled. Not openly cruel, at least not yet, but distant, disappointed. What had once been partnership began to harden into resentment. Catherine remained devout, loyal, and publicly uncomplaining. She fulfilled every expectation placed upon her except the one that mattered most. By the early 1520s, a pattern had formed, even if no one named it aloud. Every son Catherine carried died. The only child to survive was a daughter. And so the explanation became simple. The queen was cursed. The queen was failing. The queen was the problem. No one asked whether the king's body might share responsibility. No one questioned whether the losses could have another cause. The science to do so did not exist, and the political cost of asking was too high. History would remember Catherine of Aragon as a woman who could not give Henry a son. What history did not yet understand was how much death had already passed through her body, and how quietly those deaths were being transformed into an accusation, not against fate, not against God, but against the woman who survived them. In 1519, everything changed, not in the queen's chamber, but elsewhere, quietly and without ceremony. A young woman named Elizabeth Blunt, one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, gave birth to a healthy baby boy. He was unmistakably Henry's. And unlike so many children born into the Tudor world, this one lived. What followed was extraordinary. Kings had illegitimate children before. They were expected. They were tolerated. But they were usually kept in the shadows, acknowledged privately, supported discreetly, and never drawn too close to the line of succession. Henry VIII did the opposite. He claimed the child publicly. He named him Henry Fitzroy, literally, son of the king. He showered the boy with titles, lands, and honors, eventually making him Duke of Richmond and Somerset. This was not an act of quiet affection. It was a statement. By recognizing his illegitimate son so openly, Henry was proving something. To the court, to foreign ambassadors, and perhaps most of all, to himself. His body worked. His seed was strong. He could father healthy boys. The implication was impossible to miss. If Henry could produce a living son with another woman, then the long chain of deaths that haunted his marriage must have a single explanation. And that explanation could not be the king. It had to be Catherine. Years of loss were suddenly reframed. The stillbirths, the miscarriages, the sons who died within days or weeks. What had once been seen as tragic misfortune began to look, in Henry's mind, like evidence. Evidence that the queen herself was defective, that her body was incapable of completing the task demanded of it. For Catherine, this moment was devastating. She had endured pregnancy after pregnancy, buried child after child, and remained unwaveringly loyal. Now, a living boy existed, one who did not come from her womb. And that boy carried a message sharper than any accusation spoken aloud. Henry Fitzroy did not threaten the throne directly. He was illegitimate. His claim was weak, but his existence undermined Catherine in a way no argument ever could. It shifted the narrative away from chance and suffering and toward blame. From this point on, Henry's doubt hardened into conviction. The problem, he decided, was not fate. It was not God, and it was certainly not himself. It was the woman who shared his bed and whose body, in his eyes, had failed him one time too many. When Anne Boleyn entered Henry's life, she carried more than desire. She carried expectation. By the early 1530s, Henry had already spent years dismantling his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. He had broken with Rome, defied the Pope, and torn England away from centuries of religious authority. None of this was done for love alone. It was done for sons, and was expected to provide. They married in secret in January 1533. The stakes were absolute. That September, and gave birth to a child who lived. A daughter, Elizabeth. She was healthy, intelligent, strong, but she was not a boy. And while Henry publicly acknowledged her, the disappointment was unmistakable. Still, hope lingered, and had proven she could conceive. Surely the next pregnancy would bring what Henry demanded. In the summer of 1534, Anne appeared pregnant again. Contemporary letters and ambassadorial reports suggest visible signs, but the pregnancy ended without ceremony. No announcement, no public mourning. Whether it was a miscarriage or a stillbirth remains uncertain. What matters is that no child survived. Pressure intensified and lived under constant scrutiny. Her body watched, her moods noted, her failures quietly counted. The promise that had justified the destruction of Henry's first marriage was beginning to look fragile, and Henry, who had once pursued her obsessively, grew impatient. By October 1535, Anne was pregnant again. This time, the fear was palpable. Henry's attention had begun to wander. His patience was thinning, and understood the stakes better than anyone. If she failed now, she would not be forgiven. Then, in January 1536, disaster struck. While jousting, Henry's horse fell on him. The king was knocked unconscious for nearly 2 hours. For a time, it was unclear whether he would survive. When the news reached Anne, 5 months pregnant, she was reportedly overwhelmed with terror, not only at the thought of losing her husband, but at what that loss would mean for her own position, protected only by a daughter. 5 days later, Anne miscarried. The child was a boy. She later told Henry that the shock of his accident had caused the loss. In a world without medical understanding of stress and pregnancy, the explanation made sense. But by this point, Henry was no longer interested in explanations. Something had shifted. This miscarriage was not treated as tragedy. It was treated as proof. Henry became convinced that Anne had deceived him, that she had bewitched him, manipulated him, lured him into destroying his marriage, his faith, and his kingdom for nothing. In his mind, the failure was not random. It was personal. By then, Henry's own body was beginning to betray him. The jousting accident marked the start of visible decline, chronic pain, reduced mobility, and a temper sharpened by discomfort. The powerful, athletic king of his youth was slipping away. And with that loss came a deeper, more dangerous need to assert control, and was arrested in April 1536. The charges were sweeping and implausible: adultery, treason, incest. Men were named, confessions extracted, evidence assembled with remarkable speed. The process moved quickly, as if the outcome had been decided long before the trial began. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was beheaded on Tower Green. She was not executed because she lacked loyalty. She was not executed because of proven crimes. She was executed because she had failed to deliver a son, and because Henry needed someone to absorb the consequences of that failure. Anne's death closed one chapter and opened another. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour, desperate to prove, to the court, to Europe, and to himself, that his body could still do what it once had. But the miscarriage of January 1536 had already marked the end of hope for Anne Boleyn. Not because of evidence, not because of justice, but because in the Tudor world, when a king's obsession met his fear, someone had to pay. When Jane Seymour married Henry VIII, she represented something Anne Boleyn never could in her final months: calm obedience, silence, and reassurance. She did not argue theology. She did not challenge authority. She promised stability, and above all, sons. In early 1537, Jane conceived. This pregnancy unfolded differently from those before it. There were no public dramas, no visible tension between king and queen. The court watched carefully, almost fearfully, as the months passed. Henry was already 45 years old. His health was visibly declining. This child was not just an heir, it was a last chance. On October 12, 1537, after a long and difficult labor, Jane gave birth to a healthy boy, Edward, Prince of Wales. England erupted in celebration. Church bells rang. Bonfires were lit. The court rejoiced as if a curse had finally been lifted. For nearly 3 decades, Henry had chased this moment through marriages, executions, and religious upheaval. Now, at last, he had what he had demanded from so many women: a legitimate son. But the triumph was brief. Within days, Jane fell ill. She developed a fever, likely the result of infection caused by the trauma of childbirth or a retained placenta. Conditions that modern medicine treats routinely were, in the 16th century, often fatal. Tudor physicians could do nothing. They watched. They prayed. They waited. On October 24, 1537, Jane Seymour died. She was 29 years old. Henry was genuinely devastated. Contemporary accounts suggest a grief deeper than anything he had shown after the loss of Catherine of Aragon or Anne Boleyn. Jane had given him what no other woman could. In his will, written years later, Henry requested to be buried beside her. Edward survived. Jane did not. This was the central paradox of Henry's life. The one pregnancy that succeeded took the mother with it. The son who secured the dynasty was born from a body that did not survive the process.